This is Harvard on the Map, presented by the Harvard Graduate School of Design, covering innovative ideas and thought leaders in digital cartography, Earth observation, and all things geospatial, with your host, Jennifer Horowitz.
Hello, welcome to Harvard on the Map. I'm here with Professor Ann Knowles, who is a professor of history at the University of Maine and the co-founder of the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative. I'm really looking forward to speaking today.
Good, I'm delighted to be here, Jennifer, thank you.
Yeah, so let's start. You mentioned briefly before the recording got started that your background is in geography, and so you're a historical geographer. How did you find your way into historical geography?
Well, after I graduated with a BA in English from Duke University, I started working as an editor in New York City. And then I moved to Chicago, was working in book editing. I love editing, I still do that. But my favorite project of all was editing a new US history textbook whose special feature was to have over 100 maps to tell American history. So I worked on editing those maps with the man who designed them, who was the first historical geographer I'd ever met, a man named Michael Conzen at the University of Chicago. And I just fell in love. Maps, creating maps to tell stories, made history concrete, real, and fascinating for me in a way it never had been. And there was something about seeing the patterns, the meanings of geographical change and situations that really excited me. I think there's also an aesthetic part of mapping that really appealed to me. So as soon as that book was published, basically, I went to graduate school in geography at the University of Wisconsin, which was known for its historical geography. And I have never looked back. I have the zeal of the convert. I took my first geography class at the age of 30, and I still love it as much as I did then.
Wow, interesting. So now you teach historical geography, and how did you come to work within this Holocaust Geographies Collaborative? I'm fascinated to hear the story behind that.
Well, that is a fun story. I had never studied the Holocaust, never been to Poland, etc. When I got a telephone call in, I think it was 2003 or 4, from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, from a man who was working with some colleagues there, wondering, could we use GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to study the Holocaust? And as soon as he said that, I felt a sort of lightning bolt go down my spine of recognizing enormous potential. The Holocaust was such a huge and complicated phenomenon. And I knew by that time, having worked with GIS, applying it to other historical contexts, that GIS has huge capacity for dealing with data. And I thought it was an incredible opportunity. So I started working with him and some new friends, other historical geographers, and we ended up forming the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative and kind of miraculously got funding from the National Science Foundation to run what became a 7-year research project to begin to think about how to study the Holocaust geographically. And that produced our first book, simply called Geographies of the Holocaust.
Wow, fascinating. So now tell me, is it, have you gotten feedback from the Holocaust studies community on this project? What has been sort of the outward response to the project? It's such an interesting one.
The response to the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative has been one of the most gratifying phenomena of my career, because gradually, year by year, conference to conference, more and more people came to our sessions. We began with a workshop on how to use GIS for Holocaust history with, I think, 3 people in the audience in around 2010. the last live conference that we had almost 3 years ago, it was standing room only.
Wow.
Our work really began a spatial turn in the Holocaust studies. There have been several edited books now that have taken up this theme over the last couple of years. I now serve, and one of my colleagues has served on the advisory board for the Holocaust Education Foundation. And it is warmly embraced for the same reasons that I think originally animated my excitement. And it's not just GIS, it's also bringing in critical social theory about the importance of space and place in human history, excuse me, and everything that we do as people is placed, and we move through and evaluate and shape space. So it's become a big part of Holocaust studies, and it's attracting a lot of young scholars, which means it's going to keep growing.
That's wonderful. It's really incredible work. And, you know, for GIS professionals who are not as familiar with how to, you know, document the Holocaust spatially, what advice would you have in terms of getting involved and becoming more aware of how to use their skills towards documenting historical geography in that space?
That's a really nice question, one I haven't thought about before. I think if one has GIS skills and you're interested in the Holocaust, that is enough to get started. If you read our book, and there's now a literature of, you know, dozens of articles and some other books that use these methods and think spatially, and look for either the event or the region that particularly interests you. You will need to be prepared to build your own data sets. There's still, perhaps I should back up and explain, one of the things that I've been doing as a member of the collaborative is develop some foundational data sets for studying the Holocaust spatially. One is a data set of the SS managed concentration and labor camps. That's 1,111 of those places with attributes attached. For the last 4 years, I've been developing with many other people an historical GIS of ghettos in German-occupied Eastern Europe. That's another 1,142 places. We're building some online tools to share our data. We hope this project comes to an end in August, and we hope maybe a year from now to publicly share all of our data. So that will be some of the first really scholarly, well-documented data that people can use to study fundamental places and patterns of the Holocaust, including the development of those systems over space and time. There are different conditions, different kinds of forced labor, even movement in and out of ghettos. We're trying to enable people to map, including ourselves. So there are some other data sets out there, but most people still have to develop their data sets by hand to answer their particular historical questions. Have you done any historical mapping yourself?
Actually, I've done some, you know, on the cholera epidemic, you know, where you have John Snow and you see how he mapped it, and then, you know, you see the spread of it, which was fascinating. You know, I have issues in a more modern perspective, you know, cleaning data and finding data. I always love finding a fun, interesting geographic data set. I love mapping things that maybe people don't necessarily map. I did a UFO sightings in the United States recently, which was super fun, but certainly not as much weight as Holocaust geography. And so I wonder, are there issues in terms of we know the Germans kept very detailed records, but are there issues in terms of finding data or a lack of data in certain spaces or certain aspects?
Enormous issues.
Fascinating. Okay.
In two directions, I would say. First of all, I would, rather than talking about finding data on the Holocaust, I would think of it as finding historical sources on the Holocaust that can then be turned into data or extracted as data. There are enormous records. You could map 1 million subjects because the German records are so rich. because there also, if you have other languages, there was a Soviet commission on Nazi crimes that began collecting data as early as 1941 or 42 about what the Germans had done in territory that the Soviets reconquered that is equally rich, just astonishing material. So that's one thing. But then to your bigger question about uncertainty, ambiguity, gaps, absolutely. Even in our Ghettos project, which is based on a very large encyclopedia of ghettos from the Holocaust Museum, authoritative, really well researched, really well documented. The swifter the Nazi takeover, the swifter the move to genocide, the less historical material has survived, the fewer survivor accounts there are. And so part of what our Ghettos project is going to try to demonstrate is that what we know about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe anyway is really different between Western Poland, where there's a great deal of information, and say Lithuania and Ukraine, where in many places there's almost nothing. So it's also setting an agenda for further research, more interviews. So if one is going to start using GIS for the Holocaust, I think you can do mapping of some existing data, but if you really want to get into it, it takes a longer commitment and becoming, at least partly, an historian as well as a GI scientist. But the other thing, of course, is that you can collaborate. So people who are trained up in GIS will be incredibly valuable to more and more Holocaust scholars who don't have those skills. So my collaborative is unusual in being a group of people who are both trained up in GI science and able to imagine maps and make them, and humanists with no background at all like that. One of my closest collaborators, Paul Jascott at Duke University, is an art historian and an historian of architecture who specializes in how the Nazis incorporated all kinds of symbolic meaning in the buildings that they created, like design choices at Auschwitz, for example. And Paul now understands GIS, and he's done a little bit himself, but he's able to rely on me and my students to do the sort of heavy lifting with data development and GIS use. And I learn from him constantly about how historians have interpreted the Holocaust, who I should read, what our arguments are, and how that's going to communicate our findings to Holocaust studies people, most of whom are not yet GI scientists.
Fascinating. Wow. Well, this is, especially given my own familial history, it's really interesting to hear that there's this combination of, of Holocaust history, but then also GI science. I could keep you here all day, but I won't. I know that you have a busy schedule. But my final question, which I ask all of my interviewees, which is to describe a time when you were lost, whether that was physically, whether you were physically lost or metaphorically lost in your life or career, and how you found your way back again.
It was 9/11. I was living in Washington, D.C. I was unemployed. As an historical geographer coming out of University of Wisconsin in the 1990s, my specialty was considered old-fashioned and out of date. So I wasn't getting job interviews. I applied to 60 places before I got interviews that finally landed me a job at Middlebury College. And when 9/11 happened, I went to church for the first time in ages, big Presbyterian church in Washington, D.C. And I came out of the church and for the first time in my life said, and this is not a religious thing, it was like desperation, God, what am I supposed to do? And fell to my knees and heard an answer. The answer was, you must teach, because that is how you can communicate your understanding of geography with the world. That was September. I decided, okay, I'm going to apply one more time for jobs. And kind of miraculously, there were 3 jobs that I suited that fall, to which I applied, and I got interviews at all. And one of them was Middlebury College, who gave me an offer, my one offer, and I got the job. And it was, some years later, more than a decade later, that call came from the Holocaust Museum. So I don't believe in fate, but I'm grateful for that moment and for being able to have the good luck of holding on to what I really loved, really believed in, and to find even more meaningful work down the road.
That's incredible. Well, thank you for sharing your story. And this has been one of the more fascinating interviews I've had on the program, and I really appreciate your time.
It's very nice to meet you, Jennifer, and I hope we can meet in Cambridge someday.
Yeah, anytime you're around, please do. Yeah.
Take care.